And welcome back, Professor Almeida, jpalmeida.com. Welcome to my final lecture in my series on critical thinking, and today we're going to look at fallacies. This talk coincides with Chapter 4 of the OER textbook, Intro to Logic and Critical Thinking. And by the end of this lecture, you should be able to define what a fallacy is, to be able to understand the difference between formal and informal fallacies, to be able to understand and identify informal fallacies. Specifically, we're going to look at composition, division, begging the question, false dichotomy, equivocation, and then we're going to get into slippery slope fallacies, and finally fallacies of relevance. So we're going to cover the different types of fallacies as outlined in Chapter 4. Now, I want to begin by defining what a fallacy is, and a fallacy is simply a mistake in reasoning. Now, in looking at the difference between formal and informal fallacies, you're really looking at the form versus the content. So keep that in mind as you're going through the reading. With formal fallacies, they are arguments whose forms are invalid, and the meaning of the sentences don't matter. There are two formal fallacies as covered in the reading: denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. And here are the forms for the two formal fallacies. When it comes to denying the antecedent, it goes something like this. If A is B, then A is C. A is not B, therefore A is not C. With the affirming the consequent fallacy, if A is B, then A is C. A is C, therefore A is B. Again, the form is important here. When it comes to informal fallacies, on the other hand, we cannot identify them without understanding the concepts involved in the argument. And again, we're going to go over the different fallacies as discussed in the reading. Let's start with the composition fallacy. With the composition fallacy, one argues that since each part of the whole has a certain feature, then the whole has that feature. In other words, every part of X has Y, therefore the whole X has Y. Again, it's not the form, but the content. So let's look at this example here. Every student in the class has been to Las Vegas. Therefore, the class has been to Las Vegas. So let me ask you this. Does the conclusion follow? Take a moment to guess, and I'll be waiting right here. Okay, so what do you think? Again, let's look at this example here. Every student in the class has been to Las Vegas. So what we're saying here is that every individual student has been to Las Vegas. The conclusion is, therefore, the class has been to Las Vegas. Well, if we're talking about the class, we have to talk about the class as a whole. That means the class has been to Las Vegas as a group. Does this follow from the premise where every individual student in the class has been to Las Vegas? So you can see where the fallacy is. But let's look at another example. Every piece of this car is made of plastic, therefore the whole car is made of plastic. Now here, there is no fallacy committed because indeed every part of the car is made of plastic. We can then say the entire car is made of plastic. Does that make sense? Again, this is something that's going to take some practice. With the division fallacy, we're going in reverse here. With the division fallacy, one argues that since the whole has a certain feature, then each part has that feature. Or X has Y, therefore each part of X has Y. Again, it's not the form, but the content. So again, let's take, for example, the whole car is made of plastic, therefore each part of this car is made of plastic. Okay, so that is the example here. It's not a fallacy. But let's look at this one here. The Lakers played their worst game tonight, therefore each Laker played their worst game tonight. Does the conclusion follow? Now, while the Lakers may have played their worst game, who's to say that Lonzo Ball didn't have his best night in that same game? Okay, so again, we see where the fallacy is committed. Just because the whole team, or the team as a whole, had their worst game, maybe they lost by like 40 points or something, that doesn't mean that every individual player had their worst game too. Again, Lonzo Ball could have been lighting it up. Let's look at these examples. The whole team perished in the plane crash, therefore each person on the team died in the crash. Does the conclusion follow? In this case, it does. How about this? Each person on the team is on the plane, therefore the whole team is on the plane. Again, the conclusion follows here. Let's look at begging the question. With begging the question, the premises assume the truth of the conclusion instead of supporting it. Take these examples. Left-handed people are better writers because right-handed people can't write as well. Or how about this? It's appropriate to put someone to death for murder, therefore capital punishment is justified for murder. Does this sound like circular reasoning to you? I have this image here from the TSA. Why do I have to show my ID? Well, because identity matters. We need to make sure your ID and boarding pass match. Okay, so how does identity matter? Okay, so you can see that this is essentially what's called begging the question. Let's look at false dichotomy. False dichotomy is a disjunction that does not exhaust all the possible options. Basically, you're left with, in most cases, two choices, but sometimes there may be several choices, but they don't tell you about the other choices you have. So here's a famous example from President Bush after 9/11. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists, right? You only have two choices. You're either with President Bush or you're with the terrorists. But is it possible to not be on either side? Maybe you don't support President Bush, but at the same time you don't support the terrorists. But here with the false dichotomy, you're not given that option, right? You're presented with one of two choices. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Okay, so that's what the fallacy is. How about the fallacy of equivocation? Here, we're using a word or expression in different senses throughout an argument, which leads to a false conclusion. Take, for example, this statement. Kids are a headache. Taking aspirin makes headaches go away. Therefore, aspirin will make kids go away. So you could see how the meaning of headache changed. Or how about this example? Taking a logic class helps you learn how to argue. But there is already too much hostility in the world today, and the fewer arguments, the better. Therefore, you shouldn't take a logic class. Well, you'll see how argue and argument are used equivocally. Okay, so hopefully you understand how this fallacy happens. So before I go on, I hope this video has helped, and if it does help, feel free to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and be sure to click on the bell to receive notifications. Let's switch gears and talk about slippery slope fallacies. Slippery slope fallacies depend on vague concepts or claims, and there are two types as covered in the reading here, conceptual and causal. And we're going to look at some more examples here. Let's look at an example of a conceptual slippery slope. It's illegal for anyone under 21 to drink alcohol, but there's no difference between someone who's 21 and someone who's 20 years and 11 months. So there's nothing wrong with someone who's 20 years and 11 months drinking. But since there's no real difference being a month younger or a month older, then there shouldn't be anything wrong with drinking at any age. Therefore, there's nothing wrong with allowing 15-year-olds to drink alcohol. Okay, do you see what's happening here? So this fallacy assumes that because we can't distinguish between adjacent stages, specifically the difference between 20 years and 11 months versus 21 years old, then we can't distinguish between any stage. So you can see how we went from 21 years and then we started to talk about 15-year-olds. Okay, that's a conceptual slippery slope. With causal slippery slopes, the best example here are those DirecTV ads. Okay, so I don't know if you've ever seen those DirecTV ads on TV where they just go from one link to the next, one event to the next, because you didn't ditch your cable, right? So let me give you an example of this. As a matter of fact, there's an example in the reading here, and here's a transcript of one of those ads. If you use cable, your cable will probably go on the fritz. If your cable's on the fritz, you'll probably get frustrated. When you get frustrated, you'll probably hit the table. When you hit the table, your young daughter will probably imitate you. When your daughter imitates you, she'll probably get thrown out of school, and on and on and on and on and on. And with this fallacy, it assumes that each event link is probable. And if you remember the last lecture where we covered probabilities, you can actually do the math here, and you can just pretend to give a probability of a certain situation happening, and then you just start multiplying the probabilities of each event. And again, you can see the example that's done here in the book. So let's look at each event. If you use cable, then your cable will probably go on the fritz, and the author assigned 0.9. If your cable is on the fritz, then you'll probably get angry, again 0.9. And then what the author does is the author multiplies 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.8, and so on and so on and so on. And then with the numbers they chose, they saw that the probability of the conclusion, if you use cable, you'll have a grandson with a dog collar, is only 27%. So you can see how easy it is to use the previous concepts, specifically in Chapter 3 concerning probabilities, and apply them to a fallacy like this one. Let's now look at fallacies of relevance. When it comes to fallacies of relevance, they make an argument or a response to an irrelevant argument. Now, one thing you have to be very careful with these types of fallacies, they can be psychologically or emotionally compelling. I've mentioned Scott Adams in the past. He's the creator of Dilbert. He's a trained hypnotist. And if you ever follow Scott Adams, a lot of times he says that facts don't matter. When it comes to persuasion, persuasion is more emotional and psychological, right? He always says that facts doesn't matter. And when it comes to these types of fallacies, again, they are meant to be psychologically or emotionally compelling. So there are different types of fallacies of relevance. We're going to look at ad hominem attacks, straw man fallacies, tu quoque, genetic fallacies, and finally appeals to consequences and appeals to authority. Let's look at ad hominem. Instead of refuting an argument with an ad hominem attack, the person attacks the other person making the argument rather than the argument itself. And you can see that I have a perfect example of this with President Trump saying, "You are fake news," right? That's a form of an ad hominem. Here are a couple of other examples. Well, let's look at my opponent's failures on education. So here, let's say we have two politicians, it's 2018, it's election season, and you have two politicians debating, and one politician is talking about how they're going to fix education, and then the other politician, the opponent, says, well, let's look at my opponent's failures on education. That's an ad hominem. So instead of attacking the argument from the other person, that politician is instead attacking the person himself. Of course you would say that. You support cronyism. So again, instead of attacking the position, that person is attacking the other person. Okay, that's basically what an ad hominem attack is. All right, let's look at straw man arguments. Here's how straw man argument works. Person 1 asserts position A. Person 2 argues against a similar position B as if it were position A. So the idea here is to make it look like that person 2 is arguing against position A, but they're setting up a similar position B. Okay, let me show you this example right here. So let's say that we have a child and a parent going back and forth. So person A is the child, person B is the parent. Can we get a dog to protect us? No. Why would you want to leave us and our house unprotected? well, maybe there were other reasons for not having that dog, but you could see how the child set it up to make it look like that the parent wants to leave the house unprotected, even though the argument here is getting a dog to protect them. So you can see how this can be a straw man argument. Here are a couple of other examples of straw man arguments. Let's say that there's a student and that student tells his or her professor that he or she thinks that some of Donald Trump's positions have merit. And then the professor turns around and says, "How could you support racism?" So you see that's a straw man argument because, again, they're setting up a different position as if it were the other position that the student brought up. Or let's look at another example. A biology teacher begins teaching evolution by stating that all things evolve. The student says that she just can't accept that humans came from bugs. Again, that's a straw man argument. Okay, so again, this takes a little practice to be able to identify them. Tu quoque means you too. With a tu quoque fallacy, you avoid answering your criticism by bringing up criticism of your opponent. And this happens a lot in politics. So again, I have person A and person B. Here's an example of an exchange where it's a tu quoque fallacy. If my opponent claims he's honest, then he should be forthcoming to the American people and release his income tax records. Person B: oh, that's rich considering that you cheated on your income taxes in 2009. So what person B is doing is making person A look hypocritical by bringing up criticisms of person A rather than answering the criticism that they're not releasing their income tax records. Do you see how that works? Okay, so that is a tu quoque fallacy. Now, with a genetic fallacy, one argues that the origin of something is enough of a reason to either accept or reject it. So again, here's person A and person B. Person A: we should allow physician-assisted suicide. Person B: did you know that the idea was first used in Nazi Germany? So you see what person B did here. The idea is associated with Nazi Germany, so there must be something wrong with the idea itself. Okay, that's what a genetic fallacy looks like. Okay, so we are almost wrapping up this lecture, and I want to show you two more types of fallacies: appeal to consequences and appeal to authority. When it comes to appealing to consequences, something must be true or acceptable because if it weren't, there would be negative consequences. Here are two examples of this. I don't believe that my friend lied to me because if she did, then our friendship would be over. Okay, so you can see here that something must be acceptable because if it weren't, there would be negative consequences as a result. Or how about this one? How many of you have heard this out and about? If you don't believe in God, you will go to hell. Okay, so that is an example of appealing to consequences. All right, let's look at the last type of informal fallacy here: appeal to authority. Something must be true or acceptable because it's believed by someone who is an authority on the subject. That someone may or may not be an authority, but the argument here relies on the credibility of the authority of the figure. You see this a lot, especially in advertising. So let me give you an example of this. You've probably seen it in an ad somewhere, and I'm going to change the names of the toothpaste companies in question. 3 out of 4 dentists choose Acme toothpaste for their own families. You should choose Acme too. Again, I'm pretty sure you've seen commercials like this. Okay, that is an appeal to authority. Okay, so that was a quick lecture, and as always, this takes practice. And I want to ask you, what are some fallacies you have heard or seen? And if you are in my COSA 2 class, there are 2 assignments related to this. Number one, you do have a discussion post that pretty much asks that same question. What are some fallacies that you've heard or seen? So make sure that you do a good write-up of that. But also, we're going to use a piece of software called Inspiration, and I'm going to make a separate how-to video. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of how-to videos on YouTube, so use those videos as well to help guide you along. And that's pretty much it. So again, if you have found this lecture helpful, feel free to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.